A decade ago, during the Great War Centenary, the BBC released a three-part drama about the First World War. Our World War told the story of the conflict from Mons to the Somme to Amiens in 1918. 10 years on, what does it tell us about the Great War, and is it a series that is still relevant today? It's hard to believe that the Great War Centenary began more than a decade ago. I remember author John Giles and founder of the Western Front Association talking about this in the 1980s and what it might mean to ensure that the wider subject of the First World War did not slip from public consciousness, because he was acutely aware that by the time of that centenary, all of the veterans, the men that he'd known for all of his life and respected so greatly, they would all be gone. And that's what people feared back then, because they could see that generation of veterans already fading. The First World War in the 1980s was very much a kind of niche subject. Very few people were visiting the battlefields. What did the future hold? But for John Giles and so many in that early phase of the history of the Western Front Association were looking ahead to this centenary period and saw it as a promise of greatness. And we've lived through it now. Many of you will have been involved in Great War Centenary projects. And while there were many good and bad aspects of that centenary, and some organisations made more of it than others, the good thing a decade on from it is that the Great War is just as vivid, just as important, and continuing to engage people, young and old. And while there may not be the massive level of visitors to the battlefields that was seen between 2014 and 2018, that does not mean that there are not thousands of people visiting the Western Front, Gallipoli, and other theatres of war that are accessible on a big scale, because clearly they are. And the success of podcasts like this and so many others that are out there about the First World War and YouTube channels shows that there is a desire for interest and knowledge and the capture and expansion of knowledge through these different and new mediums. And I discovered over the Christmas break, when I had some time to look at the statistics for the podcast for 2024, that a quarter of the audience who listen to this are under 35. So again, this is not just kind of an old person's or a middle-aged person's interest. It seems to cut across all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of age, and as we've said, continues to engage a new audience. And all of this pleasantly surprised me. But it's not the centenary or the success or failure of the centenary that we're here to discuss as such in this episode, but thinking about how there were landmark points during that centenary. One of those was some of the drama that was put on to engage exactly what we've discussed, a bigger and a wider and perhaps a new audience. So what we're going to discuss in this episode is a drama series that quite a lot of you have asked me to do a podcast on. What is it? Well, Our World War was a three-parter produced for the BBC with 3 60-minute episodes looking at 3 specific angles and time periods of the Great War. It's easily accessible still today because it's on BBC iPlayer. I rewatched it just this last weekend to refresh my memory as to what the series was about and how it was presented. So having listened to this podcast, you could go straight onto iPlayer and watch it if you were so inspired to do so. And it was a series that was based on an earlier one called Our War, which was about the then still raging conflict in Afghanistan. And much of the same production team that worked on that also worked on Our World War. It was not a kind of top-down view of the First World War. It was very much kind of a view from the ranks, just as Our War was about Afghan. And it was very different in many ways to previous Great War drama, in the way it was filmed and produced, and the kind of music, which we'll discuss, that was used in it. And in my mind, it was set apart compared to some of the other drama that was produced by different production teams during that Great War Centenary. This series was gritty, filmed in a modern, dynamic way. They used GoPros to get point of view shots as people were running about or firing weapons, which was much rarer then, and using some of the latest graphics and modern music that many perhaps would not even have associated with this period, as it was recent music. And there's a bit of a parallel to now, as many of you who are listening to this will have seen on the BBC in January the second series of SAS Rogue Heroes. And Our World War is kind of a cousin of that. It's not quite the same as Rogue Heroes, not perhaps as cartoonish as Rogue Heroes, but it's the same kind of thing. And it draws in, I would guess, just as that does, a very different kind of audience. Unlike the SAS series, Our World War follows real people in real battles, with each episode based around a central individual soldier. And each episode as well starts with a statement. Modern warfare is brutal. 100 years ago, it was unimaginable. Only those who were there knew what it was like. This series is based on what they told us. So what I think that this series set out to do, perhaps just like SAS Rogue Heroes, is not to necessarily just appeal to the military history audience, those already fascinated by the subject. It was looking to bring in a new audience, an audience that perhaps wouldn't normally look at programs and watch programs like this and engage them in ways that they understood. And we'll kind of talk about some of that as we go through the episode. So let's now move on and let's drill down into the 3 episodes of Our World War, see what they tell us about the Great War, and discover what issues we find with the history that we see presented within them, and whether those films still feel relevant a decade on from when they were released. There were 3 episodes of Our World War, 3 60-minute episodes, and each one looked at a different time frame in that period of the conflict. Episode 1 is called The First Day, and logically for a series like this, it examines 1914, the start of the Great War for Britain, and this would have been broadcast very close to the centenary of when these events had taken place, so it made it quite moving in that respect, I think. And it focuses in this first episode, The First Day, on one aspect of that 1914 campaign, the place where, for the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force, the first major shots of the war were fired, and that's the Battle of Mons on the 23rd of August 1914, and within it focuses on just one battalion. In a drama, you can't tell every story. In this, they focus on what was really the tip of the spear just outside of Mons, near to the village of Nimy, which was the 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. And they were dug in along the Mons-Condé Canal, near to 2 of the bridges in the village of Nimy, just outside Mons. Only one of those bridges, the main bridge, really features in this story, and again we'll return to that. And what you have from the very beginning, this is not conventional drama because it brings in modern music almost at once and kind of sets the tone, really, I think, for what these are. The storyline moves very rapidly, the characters develop very rapidly, and it's really an action kind of drama rather than quiet contemplation, I guess reflecting the nature of what the producers felt modern warfare and warfare in the Great War was like. They were not looking to glamorize it, they were not looking to exaggerate it, they wanted to try and tell, I guess, a central truth based on the research that they'd done through these voices of the Great War that they'd looked at. So what we see straight away, that it's shot, it's filmed in a first-person shooter style. Now, 10 years ago, video games, FPS video games, first-person shooter games like Call of Duty were incredibly popular. They probably still are today. But this film kind of mirrored that approach and looked to tap into that Call of Duty generation to get them to watch this rather than just a narrow kind of audience. So you see that really as a feature of all 3 episodes in this series. And one of the features in the Call of Duty video games at that time were top shot views of battlefields, where they did a kind of sonar radar top view down, showing whiteouted features and then little images of people moving across that battlefield. And that's the kind of graphics that is used very much in this series, and is very, very effective, I think, because it kind of gives you a wider aspect of what's going on this bit of the canal where the Fusiliers are. They weave in some other stories, feature some of the other bridges, and you can see that in context as well. So it's modern, it's young in many respects in the way that they approach the filming of this, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, of course. And we mentioned about the use of modern music, and really from the outset you see that. The opening sequences are mixed in with music from artist PJ Harvey. Polly Harvey, an incredibly well-known indie artist, incredibly talented, has developed a style that is almost unique over several decades and is a personal favourite of mine, and it was good to see an album that she had produced that featured aspects of Great War history in it used in this series. So we're not going to hear Keep the Home Fires Burning in this. We're going to hear tracks from Let England Shake, which was Polly Harvey's album. But all of this is very well. These are the kind of bells and whistles of this series. What about the history? Well, initially, when you kind of look at the layout where the Fusiliers are, you look at the men that are in this series that are representing soldiers. They look like soldiers. They're dressed in uniforms that they look as if they've lived in, which I think is an important element for drama to be convincing. The setup and the weapons that they're using are generally pretty good. There's a few odd bits. The Australian officer that is in the series, he was an officer in the 4th Royal Fusiliers, caused a lot of controversy and debate at the time because he was wearing an Australian drover's coat and a slouch hat. Now, that is historically inaccurate. There was an Australian officer, Lieutenant Fred Steele, who served with the 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers at Mons. He was later killed in the fighting in northern France on the 26th of October 1914. He's commemorated, he has no known grave, he's commemorated on the La Tourette Memorial there. He was the son of Philip John and Johanna Albertina Steele of Toorak, Melbourne, in Victoria, Australia, and his brothers, Philip John Rupert Steele and Norman Leslie Steele, also fell in the Great War. So that's 3 brothers killed. So he is a real person. He was one of a number of Australian citizens that were serving as regular soldiers in the British Army in 1914. But he was at Mons, he was in uniform, but I'm pretty sure I can guarantee you that he did not wear a slouch hat and a drover's coat. He would have proudly worn the officer's uniform of the British Army and the badges and insignia of the Royal Fusiliers. So that was a kind of strange exaggeration. They wanted to make the point that he was Australian, but in my mind kind of went a little bit over the top there. But he's not the focus of the story. He's one of the central characters. The focus is Sid Godley. Sid Godley was an ordinary soldier in the 4th Royal Fusiliers. He had served in the ranks and he trained as a machine gunner, and he became one of the central characters at Nimmi Bridge when the bridge was attacked and the machine gun section came under fire and they lost one gun, they lost some of their team, and then he took over. And he would eventually be decorated with the Victoria Cross for his bravery, one of the first Victoria Crosses of the Great War. Now, he's depicted as a bit of a troublesome lad. He gets into a fight with some of the guys. And again, this came under criticism at the time because there wasn't apparently much evidence of this. But I guess they were trying to reflect that the regular army of 1914 was not necessarily the same as the citizen army and the conscript army that came later. I often say to people when we travel the battlefields of the old Contemptibles, that name given to the men of the British Expeditionary Force in the Great War, that this was not an army of choir boys. It was a rough, tough army. And those sequences early on in this episode where Godley gets into trouble and fights with other soldiers is typical of the kind of experience that regular soldiers would have had before the war. So I think it's kind of a representation of that. And Sid Godley in this episode is played by Theo Barklam Biggs, who, again, with our SAS Rogue Heroes connection, he played Reg Seekings in the current series, the 2 series of that have been on BBC in the last couple of years. So there's a bit of symmetry between these 2 dramas with an actor who's in both. And there's probably some other actors in these that are also in SAS Rogue Heroes as well. The other thing, apart from these central characters, there's some minor characters, and one of them is a runner. And I think it's really good that they kind of featured the role of runners. This is long before 1917, the film, and there's a runner who is the kind of link between the tip of the spear on the battlefield, the 4th Royal Fusiliers machine gun section and the rifle teams that are engaging the Germans with headquarters back in Nîmes itself. And he runs backwards and forwards along the canal into the village to headquarters to relay messages both from HQ and from the front line and vice versa. And there's some really good shots, which are point-of-view shots filmed with GoPros or similar kinds of cameras that kind of depict his view as he's running along. But to feature runners who many people probably didn't even know existed because there's no radio communication, there probably was not time to establish any kind of laid telephone communication, so runners in these kind of early battles of the Great War were really, really important. So to me, that was a really good element of this episode because it featured on something that was a little bit left field that not a wider audience really would have been that aware of. Now, the bridge itself, which the battle takes place around, in reality, the Mons Condé Canal was quite a formidable looking canal, greatly expanded upon in the 1960s and 70s. So when you go to Nîmes now and you see the modern bridges that are there, it's a very different kind of battlefield to 1914. It was a part of the canal on the edge of Nîmes where there were 2 bridges, one a road bridge, which was a pivoting bridge, the other one was a railway bridge, which is a fixed bridge. That was a stone bridge, not a girder bridge. It is a girder bridge today because it may well have been blown at the end of the First World War as the Germans pulled back from Mons, and it was certainly blown at the beginning of the Second World War. So what we see today is a modern replacement of the original bridge. And this is where things from an outside set point of view went slightly wrong, in my opinion. The production team, or a member of the production team, actually called me before they made this series and asked a few questions about this and that, and one of them was about the bridge at Mons. And I pointed out to them that the bridge that they had gone to see on a recce with this big girder bridge is not the bridge that was there in 1914. I don't think they entirely listened to that conversation because they found a location where there was a disused railway line that had a pretty decent looking girder bridge that they felt matched the battlefield at Mons. And this set that they used, it was filmed outside in the real world with a canal, with a bridge over it, a girder bridge over it, and a wooded area close by, was very different really from the actual battlefield that the 4th Royal Fusiliers fought over in August 1914. But I guess that's the kind of compromise you have to make when you're filming in an actual place. And it gives enough of a representation, I guess, to make it a convincing looking setting for the Battle of the Bridges at Mons in 1914. But there's a few little historical elements within it that are not quite right. There were no trees close to the canal in the real battlefield at Mons. It was an urban area. There were houses and a bit of open ground, but no woodland. We see most of the weapons and uniforms looking pretty good, but they depict the machine gunners using a Vickers machine gun in this, whereas the BEF, apart from one battalion, had Maxim machine guns, earlier versions of the standard Maxim gun that Sir Hiram Maxim had developed and was in use by many European armies on the outbreak of the First World War. But that's not quite kind of counting the buttons on a uniform, but I think these are important elements that we have to consider. But there's some interesting little features in it and some nice kind of echoes of the real war of 1914. There's a bit before the Battle of the Bridge begins where the Royal Fusiliers are out on patrol and they capture a German cavalry soldier, and one of the lads says to him, "Ask him if he's eaten any babies, sir." And that kind of reflects the propaganda that the BEF went to war with the Germans murdering civilians, crucifying everything from nuns to babies on church doors, and a whole diet of hatred that you often see at the beginning of a conflict to stir up emotion and to stir people into action to do something about the conflict that has just broken out. But the real history unfolds around the bridge, and they use the graphics and maps to explain the situation and see how the battle develops and how the Germans bring up troops, take some heavy losses from the Fusiliers, then bring up their artillery and pound down those Fusilier positions. And all of this reflects exactly what happened. And it got to a point where the Royal Fusiliers holding those bridges at Nîmes, their position was untenable, and gradually the army withdrew from that salient that Nîmes was in and pulled back through Mons to begin the famous retreat from Mons. So the story kind of develops exactly as it developed during the battle, and it reflects that, I think, quite well. And we see not just Lieutenant Steele, he's a central character, directing the men on the bank to open fire with their rifle teams. And we also see the work of the Royal Engineers, which is another kind of left field element of this, where they look at a real person, Corporal Jarvis, and some members of his Royal Engineer sapper team who were charged with blowing some of the bridges. Jarvis was a Victoria Cross recipient who survived the Battle of Mons, and his story of blowing the bridges is told in this episode. We're also introduced to Lieutenant Maurice Dease, who was the officer commanding the machine gun section, who is played in this by Dominic Thorburn, and he actually is a really good representation of Dease. He looks like him, he's convincing as him, and you see him playing a pivotal role in defence of the bridge until he is mortally wounded. So it is a good representation of a very small aspect of one element, one battalion's action within the wider Battle of Mons. And in that, it kind of speaks for the wider experience, I guess, of regular soldiers in that early phase of the First World War. And Lieutenant Steele comes back into play because he pulls back with the runner and some of the other survivors, and you see him noting down the recommendation for Sid Godley's and Maurice Dease's Victoria Cross. And that is a real document, a real recommendation. He was very much responsible for the award of those VCs to both those men, and the original citation that he wrote out is in the collection of the Royal Fusiliers Museum in the Tower of London, and it cuts to that, showing that document within the museum and a curator placing it into a cabinet. And I like the way they jump out of the reconstructed drama depicting the actual events of 1914 and often come out into the modern world. And I think that very much reflects the way I look and I talk about the Great War on this podcast. So it's a good feature. And it ends with a audio recording of Sid Godley talking about his experiences that is part of a BBC archive. And I like that too. I think it's really good having seen this soldier depicted in drama, depicted by an actor. You now hear the voice of that man himself. And I think that is a really, really powerful ending to this first episode. Episode 2 is called Pals, and this moves us on in a time frame to 1916 and the Battle of the Somme. It's based on the letters of Paddy Kennedy MM of the 18th Battalion of the Manchester Regiment. Now, Paddy Kennedy was a name already known to me because he features in Martin Middlebrook's book First Day on the Somme. Middlebrook interviewed him, and I knew somebody who knew Paddy Kennedy very, very well and had relayed quite a few stories about him. So when I suddenly saw him featured in this episode, it was a pleasant surprise to see a familiar name and know a little bit about him. He was an original volunteer into the 18th Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, one of the Manchester POWs battalions. He went right through the Great War. He ended up in one of the territorial battalions of the Manchester Regiment towards the end and got the military medal in the battles of the Hindenburg Line in September of 1918. And the episode starts on the eve of the execution of a soldier. So it brings in the subject of soldiers who were shot at dawn, because Paddy Kennedy had taken part, in reality, in an execution on the battlefields in 1916. He'd been part of a firing squad and witnessed this execution of a Manchester Regiment soldier. So that was used to tell not just the story of the Battle of the Somme, but to bring in that element of First World War history as well. The episode then jumps back in time to Manchester, and Paddy and his mates are working as clerks. They're seeing the events that are taking place outside their workplace, outside their front door, and realising that they need to be a part of it. They want to be a part of it, and they are then moved to enlist as volunteers in the new army, in Kitchener's army, and join the Manchester POWs. And again, we see modern music mixed into this, as they play Teenage Kicks, for example, as you see them training and learning about being soldiers. So what we're already beginning to see is a fictionalised version of Paddy's letters and Paddy's experience, but nevertheless pretty true to his own account. The maps, again, like they had been in the 1914 episode, give us the wider perspective. They now show us the formation of the Western Front and where the Somme fits into that. And I think the map graphics in this series were particularly good, and documentary makers today could learn a lot from them. It then moves on to the experience of trench warfare. There's a lot of kind of movement of time in these. They can't, in 60 minutes, tell Paddy Kennedy's entire war in that period. They're picking on key elements of it to tell, again, that wider story. So we see trench warfare, typical Western Front, and the trenches in it are very convincing. As with a lot of reconstructed TV trenches, they can be a little bit wide, but there's a mix of specially constructed trenches for this series, and I think they also may have used Taft Gillingham's trenches that then existed in Suffolk. But what it does, it gives us an audience perhaps new to the First World War, an insight into what trenches were, what they looked like, what the experience of soldiers were like in them, and all of that, I think, is pretty convincing and pretty good. It moves on rapidly to the attack on the first day of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916, and it shows the 18th Manchesters going over the top in the attack on what was the assault on Montauban on the southern end of the Somme front that day. And again, this is pretty convincing. It's not your kind of standard drama fare of lines of men going over and getting mown down in no man's land. It actually shows a success. They attack, they suffer casualties, but they get into the German trenches and they capture that position by nightfall. And that's good, and I think important, because it kind of shows an audience that the First World War is perhaps not as they imagined it to be. It wasn't all failure. And there's elements of the outcome of that attack that are then referenced a little bit further into the storyline. But it jumps from the first day, just as happened with the Manchester POWs. They captured Montauban, they captured Montauban Alley Trench. They were now facing towards a valley, Caterpillar Valley. Beyond that, the village of Longueval, and to their immediate flank was a wood, Bernafay Wood, and beyond that was Trones Wood. And this episode then jumps to their entry into and battle within Trones Wood in that first week of July of 1916. And again, it could have shown a Passchendaele landscape, of lunar landscape of shell holes and mud and smashed trees, but it shows an intact wood, just as it was for those men who first went into these woods on the Somme in July 1916. There had been some shells fall on them, but it was not levelled flat, and that made the fighting very, very challenging for the men who were in there, and we see that reflected in the storyline and what happens to the men in Paddy Kennedy's platoon as they try to advance through that wood, get lost, can't find the enemy, and then the problems of digging in this wood are also highlighted, because digging in amongst trees is never an easy prospect. There's some odd bits in it. Michael Socha, who's one of the actors, he has a kind of Mohican camouflage on the top of his helmet. That's a little bit odd. Soldiers did put camouflage on their helmet in the First World War. Normally it was a cover that went over the helmet to break up the kind of uniform shape of it and to stop it also glaring in the sunlight. They'd often just put mud or dirt on there to do the same kind of thing, or a rough bit of paint if no cloth or webbing cover was available to go over the helmet. But a kind of camo, as we see depicted on his helmet, is something that I've never seen in any photographs of the First World War. There's a sniper sequence in it where they're advancing through Trones Wood and there's a German up in the tree, and that reminded me of some of the veterans' accounts that I remembered from interviewing them back in the 80s and 90s of men who took part in the attack at Mametz Wood, for example. I interviewed some 18th Eastern Division veterans who were in Trones Wood after this Manchester Powell's assault. So it kind of reflected very well the history that I knew, and it was good to see that too. But the only thing that kind of spoilt it for me is that this was clearly filmed in the winter, perhaps the winter of 2013-14, in preparation for its release the following year. Now, bearing in mind that they're in a battle that's in July 1916, 1st of July, incredibly hot, bright day, and for much of July the weather was good, and this is not a convincing summer landscape, it's clearly the winter. So that is a kind of a drawback, but it's a nitpicking one in many ways. But more importantly, what it does show, whether it's winter or summer, is the confusing nature of trench warfare and warfare within wooded areas. And while they're out on patrol, having dug in, not really knowing where friendly forces are or where the enemy is located, they go out on patrol and they meet William Hunt. And he is the soldier whose execution we see a glimpse into at the very beginning of this episode. Paddy and his mates then are relieved and come out of the line, just as happened with the Manchester Powells. And when he's out of the line, he bumps into a nurse that he's known from back in Manchester and he's quite sweet on. And he talks to her. He goes to look for one of the characters' brothers in a casualty clearing station close to the battlefield. And he has a conversation with her where she emphasises the scale of the casualties that she's seen. She gives a figure of 20,000, which at the time no one could have known what the actual casualty figures were. But this is, I guess, the producer's way of kind of informing the audience as to what the scale of casualties were on the first day of the Somme. But what this sequence does is it shocks Paddy Kennedy, as it probably happened in real life as well as in this drama. It shocks him when he realises that, and he says to her, "We won that battle," but yet there are these tremendous casualties. And this is one of the things about the First World War. Even when the British Army is successful, it loses huge numbers of men on the battlefield. It's one of the things that really a lot of people can't quite get their head round. Even when you look at the successful actions of 1918, breaking the Hindenburg Line, advancing to the end of the war, day after day, week after week, the army is suffering catastrophic levels of casualties because that is the only way to break through and destroy an army like the Imperial German Army, by taking the fight to them and losing men along the way. One of the terrible aspects of the history of the Great War. Out of the line, the story moves to the court-martial of William Hunt, who's now been caught and accused of being a deserter. The court-martial element of this, not very convincing to me. It's very poorly represented, a bit black and white, a bit ham-acted in many respects. They're standing in the middle of a field. They're not in a building where most field general court-martials took place. Some of the men from the unit are witnessing the court-martial. Hunt shouts out loud. There's not really a proper kind of board who's assessing the evidence and giving out a sentence to him. And he's declared a deserter, declared guilty, and the sentence is death, and that is going to be duly carried out. The execution itself, as we see depicted in this, is grim, terrible, but it is, broadly speaking, pretty accurate in the way it depicts a typical, if such a thing exists, a typical execution at this period of the Great War. And again, I'm sure the kind of audience that they were hoping to attract with this series probably were not even aware that the British Army shot 306 soldiers, and that information, that fact, is given up in the dialogue of the programme as this story unfolds. And I think it's important that people realise this aspect of the First World War, as well as the heroism on the battlefields and the bombs, bullets and bayonets. The First World War, as we often say on this podcast, operates on so many different levels, in so many different layers. And you can, of course, get obsessed with things like executions in the Great War, but I think for a wider audience, for them to see this and understand it and question these kind of things is really, really important. And it is based on a real case. Paddy Kennedy witnessed the execution of a real William Hunt, who was a pre-war regular soldier who'd served, I think, in another regiment. South Lancs comes to mind, and then ended up in the Manchester Powers as a reinforcement, was declared a deserter, and then was executed. He was a young lad. He was an orphan, had no family, and I think kind of Paddy Kennedy felt that it was almost as if he'd been erased from history, and that troubled him greatly. So while the events of the Battle of the Somme and the fighting on the Somme are very much part of this episode, it also features other aspects of the Great War, like the enlistment of volunteers at the beginning and the experience of trench warfare and men who were shot at dawn, executed by firing squad. And like the first episode, where they feature some audio of Sid Godley talking about his experiences at Mons, this one ends with a recording made with Paddy Kennedy by Martin Middlebrook sometime in the late 1960s or 70s. Now, that recording is in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. Unfortunately, it's not online to actually listen to, but I've put the catalogue entry for that interview onto the podcast website with an active link, just in case you'd want to follow that up. And if you can ever get a chance to listen to Paddy Kennedy, it's a really, really good recording. And if you've got Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme, dip into that, look him up, and you'll find some of his stories in there too. We then move on to episode 3, and the war has now skipped on a couple of years from 1916 to 1918, and this episode is called War Machine. Now, I guess they could have easily gone down the Passchendaele route to shown, more of the pointlessness of sacrifice and slaughter and all of those kind of themes that we often see in drama. But to give them credit, what they do instead is move on to the Battle of Amiens in August 1918 and the first mass use of modern tanks. And this episode is based on the unpublished account of Private Chas Rowland, who was a tank crew member in the Tank Corps in one of the Mark V tanks that was used at Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, that black day of the German army, when the Allies, the British, the Australians and the Canadians and the French to the south attacked on a wide front east of Amiens and broke the German line, signalling the beginning of the end of the Great War on the Western Front. So again, it's a kind of slightly different episode, and I think that they deserve a lot of praise for featuring something like this. It would have been difficult to get hold of a realistic-looking tank then, and also film convincing interior views of that tank, and they are. So they must have built a special set for this. It's simplified inside the tank, obviously, because the noise alone would have made any kind of voice recording impossible, but it gives us an idea of the close confines of these tanks, how the conditions inside them are very, very difficult for the crew, and I think that's a really good kind of insight again to this new audience to the First World War. Just like they might not have known that there were executions, they probably knew even less that tanks like this were used and in such great numbers. At the beginning of this episode, it tackles the issue of conscription, because in this series we've gone from pre-war regular soldiers, volunteers, to wartime volunteers, Manchester Powers and Paddy Kennedy, now on to men who have been conscripted. And you see a bit of argy-bargy between the conscript and the volunteer who's been at the front for some years. And that reflects, obviously, the experience of men on the front line at that time. So it's an insight, really, into what has become the wider war of the Great War. And we get lots of kind of little cameos in this episode and glimpses into how tanks operated. We see that their communications, again, were not radio sets, they had pigeons. And when you look at the real history of tanks, pigeons played a really important role. When tank crews got bogged down, cut off, surrounded, pigeons would be released to deliver a message to headquarters to ask for assistance, for example. And during the Centenary, we made a programme about the Battle of the Ancre, where we looked at one of the tanks that ditched near to Saint-Pierre-d'Ivion, for example. It got surrounded by the Germans. They released a pigeon. It got back to the 39th Division headquarters pretty quickly, in just minutes. They saw that the tank was in trouble, and they dispatched a battalion to go forward and fight the Germans off, who were threatening to overrun this tank. So the depiction of pigeons in this episode reflects the real history of how they were used in tank units like this. And the really good graphics and aerial shots, top shots that they use to show the movement of troops on the battlefield are really very good in this and very useful to understand a more complex battle that is not straightforward trench warfare, with tanks going forward with infantry and overrunning very quickly German positions. It also highlights the key role of the RAF. There's one bit where they look through one of the hatches in the top of the tank and they see aircraft flying over. They talk about them bombing German targets, and they did do that in the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, but a huge number of aircraft were brought up to fly over the approaching tanks, hundreds of them, to drown out the noise of those approaching tanks, so the Germans didn't realise they were coming. This is how the fortunes of the RAF had changed by this stage of the conflict. They'd gone away from clashes with knights of the air jousting in the skies over the battlefield to the more modern role of aircraft delivering fire support to men on the battlefields and doing tasks like this to drown out the noise of approaching tanks. And they use quite a lot of contemporary archive in this episode to show the movement of tanks and how tanks actually looked on the battlefield. And that's quite clever, to mix in the reconstructed tank sequences with actual tank sequences. And they don't always get it right. You see it jumping from a Mark 1 or a Mark 2 through to a Mark 4 or 5. But nevertheless, I think for a general audience in this, they probably wouldn't notice that. A rhomboid tank looks like a rhomboid tank. And they would have got a lot out of that, possibly not even realising the difference between the original archive and the reconstructed movements of the tank that was used in this episode for the filming. And you also see the vulnerability of tanks. This was a war-winning weapon at this stage of the conflict, but they're not invulnerable to enemy fire, and one of the tanks gets hit and bruised up, and you see the crew on fire. It's a truly kind of awful sequence. And that is important to kind of stress the realities, I think, of the battlefield and the use of these tanks. You also see, as the tank continues in action, the conditions within it, which is a massive part of a tank crew's experience in the First World War. The heat, the fumes, and this deafening noise. And Chaz Rowlands, the central character, gets overcome by the fumes as they're going into action, and he starts to hallucinate and is very ill indeed as a consequence of it. So you see them being successful, breaking through the German line, you see the losses in the tanks, and gradually it gets down to a point where there's just them in action. Now that's a little bit of an exaggeration. There were quite some losses within tank units in that Battle of Amiens in August 1918, and there were examples of tanks operating on their own. You've only got to read the kind of literature connected with that to find that. But I think this element is a little bit of an exaggeration. And the tank itself in this story gets hit, catches fire, the crew bails out and then remounts the tank again once the fire is put out and the engine is restarted. And one of the crew, kind of hysterical because the tank is almost brewed up, goes crazy and opens fire with one of the Lewis machine guns and takes out British infantry that is advancing alongside them. And again, that's quite cleverly observed because that did actually happen on the 8th of August 1918. When you read the history of the 10th Battalion, the Essex Regiment, who were advancing on the front of the Morlancourt Ridge on that day, one of the tanks that was allocated to their sector mistakenly opened fire on them and took out some of their guys. So this is real history, not made up for the drama. And that particular crew member who does go crazy, this is an odd part of the story in my mind. They get him out of the tank and they just leave him behind. Now, considering how close-knit these tank crews were in both World Wars, the idea of that seems very strange indeed, but that's the story they tell. And then the tank moves off to a rendezvous point at a farm. And this also feels a bit odd because most of these RV points were on locations which were well defended, or where there were friendly troops or likely to be friendly troops, or slightly away from the battle area. And in this one, as they're going potentially back and not forward, they go to a rendezvous point which is brimming with Germans, and they have a bit of a skirmish in the streets of this farm with pistols being fired, and then the tank gets started and they get away. And I think really all of these little elements, for me, make this episode, despite its good points, the weakest of the three. It wasn't one that engaged me in the same way that the Mons and the Somme episode did. And some of these storylines about leaving your mates behind and then ending up in this farm, and there's a bit where they capture a young German soldier and they decide they're just going to have to shoot him. That didn't really seem very convincing either. And that didn't feel to me as if that was based in fact. I would very much doubt that that is in the memoirs of this guy, Chaz Rowland, or these memoirs were perhaps written many, many years later, and you could perhaps question some of the things that are in them. Not having read them, I don't know. But this bit and the others really did not feel that convincing in terms of the history mixing in with the storyline of the drama. But there's a few little nuggets in there what I like. There's one bit where they're talking amongst themselves, and they talk about when the war's over and they're going to go home, and one of them says, "You've been gone so long, they've got over you. They've got over all of us." And that was an interesting statement, because that harks, I think, to the belief of many men who saw the war coming to an end, or who were there at war's ending. What are we going to do now? We've just spent all these years fighting this great war. The people back home have no idea what we've done. To them, perhaps we are dead. Our names are already on a roll of honour. When we return as real living people once more, what are they going to say? How are they going to be? And how are they going to react to us? So that was an interesting little statement, I think, that spoke a wider truth. But the crew survive, they get out of battle, and the episode ends, and it tells us within 100 days the war was over, and it talks about the casualties of the Great War, and 1 million men who served never returned. So there's a kind of focus on the dead, and the story that we read about Chaz Rowlands and the girl that he sees when he's having his hallucinations in the tank caused by the fumes, we presume that's his wife. We discover that it's not. And I won't spoil that story, but he goes to a house to deliver some information to this young woman and pass on something to her. And that ends where you kind of feel they're talking about the cost of war, the sacrifice that's been made. And he leaves as he hears her crying silently in a back room. He walks out the front door, shuts the door behind him, puts on his cap, and it's in a street that then cuts to the modern world, and the camera pans showing cars moving down the street, people going about their business, a Tesco's in the background. The modern world, the Great War is over. But for me, that was a really powerful ending to this episode, because it reflected, again, another thing that I often think about is how the Great War is all around us. We walk past these buildings where this kind of drama once unfolded during those 4 years of the First World War. And that was a kind of powerful nod to it. This series, Our World War, clearly highlighted some key and important aspects of the Great War. And the use of real personal testimony from real people who existed and served, in my mind, gave the stories featured credibility, despite some of the historical issues that we've talked about here. But Our World War was a dynamic drama series. It wasn't traditional drama. It tapped into a new vibe when it came to filmmaking, an exciting vibe in many ways that kind of brings these stories to life. And I think as such it appealed to a much wider audience than perhaps traditional, in inverted commas, whatever traditional is, traditional drama would have done. Which is why, going back to our kind of link with SAS Rogue Heroes, why you see the BBC repeating that kind of formula with series like that, and it being very popular with very high viewing figures. As we so often say on this podcast, the literature, the first-hand accounts, and the veterans' testimonies are all so important in our understanding of this period, along with the official record of the conflict as well, official histories through to war diaries and so many other sources beside. That's all part of these layers of our understanding of this subject. But drama and film, as we've said time and again on the podcast, has its place. It has its place to give us a wider understanding of the experience of war, a wider perception of the truth of that experience, the realities of conflict, and a deeper, I think a much deeper connection to the whole culture of that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.